All of a sudden, there's all of this talk about the government instituting price controls. And it's another one of these belated admissions that the economy wasn't as booming and as awesome as they tried to tell you. In fact, it has sucked for several years now. In fact, one of the primary reasons why the unemployment is about to become the biggest problem in the US economy is all of the lost purchasing power over the last couple years. The question is, would price controls fix it before unemployment gets even more out of control? And we actually have a solid answer to that question with tons of evidence from experience. People don't know. The US had already experimented with government price controls, and it wasn't some small pilot program either. This was run across the entire economy over several years. And that was with a particular focus on large businesses, those supposedly greedy corporations gouging everyday Americans. Maybe the most surprising, it was introduced and run by Republicans. What that shows is that these are not partisan issues or ideas. When the economy becomes terrible, whichever of them is in office at the time, they'll do the most insane and stupid things because politicians just can't help themselves. All of them just believe they have to do something, anything, even when that something is an awful idea that benefits no one and ends up causing more harm in the long run. Both parties are absolutely terrible when it comes to real economics, small e economics, largely because when they're desperate, they only turn to PhD economists, capital E, for answers they don't have in order to create solutions they couldn't possibly come up with. So the idea of price controls is largely a response to the fact the economy is not good. And politicians feel like they have to do something about it. Doesn't matter what it is. Find out what people are complaining about and come up with an idea that sounds like it could potentially solve a problem. But therein lies the real problem. Politicians don't understand what is actually wrong, and therefore the solutions they offer couldn't possibly fix anything. As it is in 2024, our biggest problem is not consumer prices, at least not consumer prices in the future tense. Our biggest problem is now unemployment, as even the Federal Reserve is admitting. The reason why we have unemployment in front of us is because it was never really inflation to begin with. That lost purchasing power was due to the supply shock version. And that's a huge difference and beyond the scope of our discussion here. But what that means is that price controls that are meant to, at least in theory, fix an inflation problem is the problem we don't actually have today. And that's what the markets have been telling us all along. But the problem is another problem. Everyone is told to either ignore these market signals or that market signals are just what the Fed wants them to be. Higher rates are restrictive and lower rates are something else, accommodation. When history shows, especially during inflationary periods, rates that go up are a sign of inflation. We've got rates that want to go down because the downside of the supply shock is playing out here. And everything that's happened over the last couple of years in the bond market has validated lower rates, not inflation rates, lower rates, which are consistent with recession sticking around and creating problems long after it's over. If anything, the behavior of bonds, not just in the US, remember this is globally synchronized, the behavior of the bond market, despite all of these factors, should scare the pants out of you. Not over inflation, but the opposite. What that means for lower interest rates actually mean. But as far as governments go, they see the lost purchasing power. They finally hear consumer and American complaints about lost purchasing power and consumer prices. And here they're going to come up with a solution to the problem that was 2 years ago. As I said in the introduction, this is nothing new. This is what governments always do. They look backwards at what was a big issue and don't really have any way to tell if it's still going to be one, and instead try to craft a bunch of solutions that sound like they could be solutions in order to fix a problem that we may not actually have. And that's what happened in the early 1970s. We have experience with price controls in the United States because of the early part of the Great Inflation. The Nixon administration, confronted with the starting period, the rise of consumer prices, real legitimate inflation in the late 1960s and early 1970s, because it had gone on for so long, it didn't seem to have any way of stopping. They decided that they had to do something radical. In June of 1971, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, he testified before Congress that despite a substantial increase of unemployment, it has failed to check the rapidity of wage advances. Therefore, Burns said he's come to believe that the nation must supplement monetary and fiscal policy with specific policies to moderate wage and price increases. So already by June of 71, the government was talking about doing something about controlling wages and prices. In fact, he went back to Congress the next month in July of 71 and said, expectations of inflation thus permeate the gamut of private decisions to spend and invest. And this is restraining the private efforts needed for vigorous and sustained economic recovery. This is the mainstream economic thought about expectations theory, this nonsense. A year or two ago, Burns said, it was generally expected that extensive slack in resource use, such as we have been experiencing, that's after the recession of 69-70, would lead to significant moderation in the inflationary spiral. This has not happened either here or abroad. The rules of economics are not working in quite the way they had used to. Again, there's lots of clues in what he was saying that shows you, first of all, he had no idea what was happening, but second of all, the answer was right in front of him. The inflation wasn't the government, as everyone was assuming, that it was uncontrolled fiscal expansion. It wasn't monetary policies. It wasn't interest rates one way or the other. In fact, the Fed didn't target interest rates back then or even really tried to control them. That wasn't the Fed's job, or at least it wasn't what the Fed thought its job was. It was out of control monetary expansion both here and abroad as the Eurodollar system took over. Not that any of them knew this. So they were trying to fix a legitimate inflation problem that they didn't know they really had with tools that could not have possibly worked even if they knew what they were doing. So where Burns said the laws of economics aren't working, they were working just fine. He didn't know what the economy was up to, especially the monetary system. And this is true of politicians throughout the ages. They come up with these ideas based on, at best, imperfect knowledge, when most times it is just, hey, we need to do something so that we can sell the public, the electorate, the voting public, on us doing something. And that's what the wage controls were in 1971. And contrary to popular perception, the great inflation was not really about oil prices. The oil price spike in the embargo didn't happen until 1973, 2 years after the period that we're talking about here. The Great Inflation was already about 6 years old by the time this was taking place. And that is why the Nixon administration believed they had to institute something radical, because the Great Inflation had been slowly and steadily building for around 5 and 6 years already by this point. And after they went through the 69-70 recession, consumer prices only slacked off a little bit, and then they started to rise again on the other side. So, on not understanding what was really happening, officials said, well, we got an election coming up, 1972, we better start selling the public on something else. And so on August 15th of 1971, President Richard Nixon got in front of the national television audience. They even interrupted and preempted Bonanza for this and announced there would be wage and price controls instituted in the U.S. economy. And then he also announced that they were closing the gold window and officially ending Bretton Woods, which is what a lot of people have focused on, when actually Nixon and the government at the time were more focused on wage and price controls. That was their key solution to the great inflation problem. So in that speech in August of 1971, Nixon said, prosperity without war requires action on 3 fronts. We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators, blaming everybody else. The time has come for a new economic policy for the United States. Its targets are unemployment, inflation, and international speculation. And this is how we're going to attack each of those. And the funny thing is, all 3 of those were the Eurodollar. Not, as he blamed the inflation problem on government spending. It's the LBJ administration's fault for the Vietnam War. So that's why we had unemployment. It's also the reason why we had inflation. And as far as international money speculation, no, it was unemployment and consumer prices, and the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system was uncontrolled monetary expansion in U.S. dollar denomination outside the United States. As he said, we all know why we have an unemployment problem. 2 million workers have been released from the armed forces and defense plants because of our success in winding down the war in Vietnam. And then he proposed a bunch of tax credits and investment credits and spending reductions to get the fiscal side under control, even a 10% cut in all foreign aid. As he continued, in this way, I'm reordering our budget priorities so as to concentrate more on achieving our goal of full employment. And of course, none of that was true because they wound down the Vietnam War and unemployment didn't suddenly fix itself, nor did consumer prices. And that was the second thing, moving on to consumer prices and, as he said, the cost of living. The time has come for decisive action, action that will break the vicious circle of spiraling prices and costs. I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States for a period of 90 days. In addition, I will call upon corporations to extend the wage price freeze to all dividends. I have today appointed a cost of living council within the government. I've directed this council to work with leaders of labor and business to set up the proper mechanism for achieving continued price and wage stability after the 90-day freeze is over. Because this price freeze, this wage freeze, was only the first step. Because the wage and price controls did not work. And so they were extended and changed and modified. As Robert Bleiberg pointed out in Barron's in July of 1974, after this fiasco was finally over, he wrote, as to the question of who wanted these controls, the answer is simple. With the honorable exceptions of the AFL-CIO, Professor Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago, the First National City Bank, the Wall Street Journal, and Barron's, virtually everybody wanted these controls. Let me quote the reactions of some who were incautious enough to record these for prosperity. A very good and forceful move at a critical time, said the chairman and president of Reynolds Metals Company. Excellent, said the president of Dow Chemical USA. Bold, aggressive, decisive, said the chairman of Firestone Tire and Rubber. And one wonders if they made these comments under pressure from the government because the government was specifically targeting larger corporations. But as I said, the first freeze in August of 1971 was just the first of many alterations. That first freeze went into effect in the middle of August 1971 and extended 90 days till the middle of November of 1971. And it was done at a time when it seemed like it was going to work because the economy was still recovering from the 69-70 recession. And inflation rates, even though they were modestly lower because of the recession, they were only starting to tick back up from those lows. So it looked like in the initial stage, this first freeze, maybe this was all going to work. And that led to phase 2, which began on November 12th of 1971, and its stated mission was to hold average price increases across the entire economy to a rate of no more than 2.5% per year. Sounds like a Federal Reserve target. And of course, phase 2 didn't really work as consumer prices continued to accelerate, and that led to phase 3. Phase 3 was where the Price Commission and Pay Board were replaced by another bureaucracy that Nixon said was never going to happen, this time called the Cost of Living Council. And phase 3 lasted barely 6 months because of so much success all of these were having. All these price controls, wage controls, and government control over this much of the economy. These bureaucracies that weren't going to stick around instead stuck around and continued to wreak all sorts of havoc. In fact, by the time we get to June of 1973, we had to have another freeze in the economy. President Nixon, back on June 14th of 1973, got back on national television and announced another freeze, a 60-day freeze from that point forward. As the New York Times wrote at the time, President Nixon ordered tonight a freeze on all retail prices, including those of food, for as much as 60 days. And this is, remember, 2 years later. In a nationwide television address, the president said that, quote, prices are going up at unacceptable rates despite the largely voluntary controls of his Phase 3 program. So he imposed a freeze and promised Phase 4 with tighter standards and more mandatory compliance procedures within 2 months. In effect, the New York Times wrote, Mr. Nixon gave himself 60 more days in which to devise a new means of fighting inflation, which is now running at an annual rate of more than 9%. Remember, the goal from phase 2 was to keep this at 2.5%. So July 1973, the annualized rate of the middle of 1973 consumer prices was 9%. What good were all these wage and price controls? In fact, it would only get worse. The reason why they kept changing up the strategies because none of it had any impact. None of them had any beneficial or intended impact. There were all sorts of negative, unintended consequences all over the real economy, including the fact that consumer prices only accelerated even more. As Bleiberg wrote back in 1974, shortly after the emergence of Freeze 2, which was the year before 1973, its chilling effects had begun to spread far and wide across the economic landscape, up and down the distribution pipeline. Owing to the runaway in feed grains, poultry growers began to slaughter baby chicks, while flour mills, ground between surging costs of wheat and their low price ceilings, they started to shut down. Price controls, as their advocates have claimed all along, do work like magic. They can make things disappear in the twinkling of an eye. That's what bureaucratic control over large and complex economic processes always leads to. Shortages of goods and commodities. It doesn't fix the inflation problem because prices themselves aren't the issue. They were looking in the wrong direction. And consumer prices would just continue from there on. Remember, Nixon started this price control crap in August of 1971, and the Great Inflation would not end for another 12 years. In fact, the Consumer Price Index by December of 1974, when all of these price controls were finally starting to be phased out and finally recognized as complete failures, the CPI was up around 12.3% in December 1974. At the same time, the U.S. economy was experiencing a nasty recession. Now, some of that price gains in the recession were due to the oil embargo in late 1973, but the U.S. was already in the direction of inflation, out of control inflation, as well as recession before OPEC actually moved. Now, while consumer prices would calm down in 1976, they would surge again for the rest of the decade, so that by March of 1980, the Consumer Price Index was rising at a 15% annual rate. 15%. They started the wage controls in 1971. In 1980, 15%. They never did find the source of all of that out-of-control inflation. It wasn't Vietnam, as history showed. It wasn't fiscal spending, because fiscal spending is not necessarily inflationary. There are plenty of periods where out-of-control fiscal governments do not lead to inflationary periods, actually lead to the opposite. It wasn't any of the things that politicians and economists had cited at that time in history, in the early 1970s. Of course, wages and price controls weren't going to work. They had no idea where the inflation was even coming from. In reality, wage and price controls were nothing more than the government doing something for the sake of appearing to do something. Basically, the same as the Fed and its rate hikes, and now the Fed and its rate cuts. At least the Fed realizes our biggest problem now isn't consumer prices, as the markets have been saying all along, and the markets continue to be validated by. Now the Fed says our biggest problem is unemployment, because of the lost purchasing power in the past. So price controls are not going to fix the unemployment problem that lays in front of us in the future, and we don't have an inflation issue to worry about, because we don't have the Eurodollar system pumping money and credit through the real economy. We are on the downside of the supply shock. That's where the lost purchasing power came from. And now that we're on the downside of the supply shock, we can see the disinflation. And as I keep saying, that is the bad news. It's not price bad news that we need price controls to fix. It's bad news because the economy is heading toward unemployment. All of the major markets continue to point to interest rates going lower, and not just a lot lower, but staying lower for a longer period of time. What that means is not the kind of thing that price controls could fix, assuming price controls could fix anything. I went over that in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.